Good afternoon, pushers! Welcome back to another fun and exciting discussion of Woodrow Wilson and progressive reforms. Today we're going to focus on a couple things that you guys have already studied, the 18th Amendment and Prohibition, the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. So what I'd like to do today is give you a little bit more background information and to put things in context of the Wilson administration as a whole. So let's go ahead and do it. Let me minimize myself so I don't freak you out the whole period. There we go. All right, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Prohibition. So in essence, Prohibition, what it did was it outlawed the sale, the manufacture, and transportation of alcohol within the United States. And because this is a federal constitutional amendment, this applies to the entire country as a whole. It was very unpopular. In fact, there were several states that refused to even enforce Prohibition. So the government really needed to have some type of an enforcement mechanism with that, which was the Volstead Act. But, even with this enforcement mechanism, the government's really not going to spend the time and effort it needed to adequately enforce Prohibition. So Prohibition really is always known as a failure, pretty much as a whole. Where did Woodrow Wilson stand on this issue? He vetoed, actually, this idea of Prohibition because he believed that this was a personal issue. And we talked about this in class briefly. Should the government have the right to legislate what we consume as Americans? He didn't believe that. So I think, he was kind of a prude, to be honest with you, and he didn't drink at all, but to him, that was something you had to reconcile with yourself. It's a personal decision. It's a moral issue that the government can't tell you that you can or cannot drink alcohol. Going back to the enforcement piece of this, again, it wasn't really worth the time and effort of the government, so there was never really enough government officials going around the country to really enforce this. And enforcement itself is just going to be very difficult because it is an unpopular law. And you're going to have just regular, everyday American citizens that are going to be producing their own bootleg booze. So you've got your bathtub gin, where people are literally making their own booze in their bathtub. And the sad thing about this is people were like, well, let's see, what is in this little jar over here? Oh, there's alcohol, it's rubbing alcohol. Or they'll be like, oh, what is this? Turpentine. Oh, there's alcohol in there, that must be good. So I'll put all this crap literally in the bathtub, and they'll let it ferment. And, these things like, turpentine is a paint thinner. So when they make this booze, it's toxic, it's poisonous, and people actually died from this. It's kind of crazy. On a grander scale, you have a lot of gangs that are going to take advantage of bootleg liquor, and they'll have these big things going where they're producing all kinds of alcohol illegally, and these gangs, they had bosses like your Al Capone, and they were like political machines. They literally controlled the cities. They paid off cops, they paid off politicians, and so these gangs were pretty much able to do whatever they want. And these gangs also would provide, just like the bosses, they provide immigrants and low-income people with things that they need, like food and clothing and shelter and jobs and all of that. So even all the people would be supporting the local gangs for the most part as well. And again, there's really nothing that the federal government can do about this. And most people were sympathetic to the bootleggers. They supported the gangs who were like the political machines and stuff like that. There were all kinds of what were called speakeasies in major cities, where these were illegal bars, and some of them were like kind of funky, like they were in basements and cellars. Some of them you go down these like dark corridors, these alleys, and then at the end of the alley there'd be this door, and then like you do some like secret knock, and then someone would like open up this little window and, what's the password, please? And you give them the password, and then they open the door, and then there's like all of these people in there, there's booze in there, people are playing jazz music, and it's a giant like underground illegal nightclub, and these things were all over the place. So here you have this law that isn't really being enforced, and it's I'm not going to say everyone, but so many people, the majority of the people are going to be uh, willingly violating the law, because to most people, they're going to kind of agree with Wilson that this is a personal moral issue, and the government should not be able to legislate what we consume. So, needless to say, prohibition is pretty much a failure. It will be repealed when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1933 with another constitutional amendment, which is the 23rd Amendment. And there's a couple reasons for that. I mean, one, it's just an obvious failed social experiment. And then secondly, when Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1932, we were in the Great Depression. And one of the things that Roosevelt promised in his inaugural address was jobs. And when the Great Depression was at its worst, we're looking at 25% unemployment. And the alcohol industry is actually really big. So if prohibition is lifted, then that could provide a heck of a lot of jobs. So that's the other reason why we're going to have prohibition being repealed in 1933 by the 23rd Amendment. Here's a photograph of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. And remember, women played a really significant role in prohibition. In fact, many people didn't even want women to have the right to vote because they knew that women, more so than men, were on board with prohibition. So they were trying to keep the vote from women so they can continue to drink, which is kind of interesting. What else we got? Oh, and there's Carrie Nation. So if you remember, Carrie Nation was this radical prohibitionist. She was extremely religious. She kind of went cuckoo after her husband died, and she would take a Bible in one hand, a hatchet in the other hand, and she would go to saloons and she would hack at the bars while she's reading out of her Bible. She was arrested like 30 times, by the way, for doing this. And you can see, I mean, she's a pretty imposing figure as well. She was like 6 foot tall. She was 175-ish pounds or so. And, she definitely, when she put her hatchet down on that bar, man, I mean, she had a lot of oomph that she was putting into that. Kind of interesting. Gosh, I'm not sure when this came out, but I want to say like maybe in the 60s or 70s, there was an opera that was in dedication to her. There was also some, like, I think it was an all-girl band from the 1960s or so. There was a really, really bad movie called Valley of the Dolls. Kind of like it's a cult movie. It's weird. Anyways, there was a band in there. I think they did a couple songs, but they were called the Carrie Nations. So she's kind of one of those cultish type of figures that kind of lives on in our folklore. She's kind of interesting. Oh, here are some guys that are pouring booze down the drain, and probably, here you probably have a government official, an enforcement official, part of the Volstead Act. So all this booze going down the drain. What's kind of interesting is that some of the big beer manufacturers for that time, like Anheuser-Busch, Anheuser-Busch, how do you say it? Anheuser, I think it's Anheuser-Busch. Anyways, they converted their beer plant to an ice cream factory, and then Coors, they converted their factory to making pottery and ceramics, which is really bizarre. You also had the production for the first time of what was called near beer, which was like non-alcoholic beer. So in addition to people producing their own beer, you also have near beer. All right. Here you have an illegal bootlegging business going on, and again, you've got probably some government officials over here and some local police officers putting down this facility. Another interesting tidbit about prohibition is that one of the things that helped bring prohibition down was the fact that with World War I, Starting in 1914, the United States is going to play a significant role in sending food over to the Allies before we actually get involved in the war. When we do get involved in the war, we'll continue to need to like conserve on the home front. We're going to continue to send food and supplies, of course, over to Europe. And one of the things that was needed were grains and barley, for instance. So a lot of people, like once we got involved in World War I in 1917, a lot more people were kind of on board with the idea of prohibition because it was a way to help in the war effort. So it was a little bit more patriotic, I guess, to support prohibition, so we could make sure that we could send some the foods that were made from grains and barley and stuff, to send that over to the troops instead of turning it into beer. And then that brings us to the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. So we've talked a lot about women and the women's rights movement, really starting going all the way back to, gosh, probably Abigail Adams in the late 1700s. Remember the ladies was her famous quote. So the 19th Amendment is not, the idea of women's suffrage is not something new. We can go back to the 1840s and the Seneca Falls Convention with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her Declaration of Sentiments, rewriting the Declaration of Independence to include women. Now, if you remember, women were very active during that reform era in the 1840s, and abolitionism was one of those things that was obviously very important to a lot of these reformers. And women, they began to take a back seat when it came to suffrage because they understood, at least their perspective was that abolitionism was more important at that point in time than women's suffrage was. So they put their movement off, and they really thought that once the war was over, the Civil War was over, that everyone would be given the right to vote, and it'd be great. But as you guys know with the 15th Amendment, that it basically just gave all men the right to vote and excluded women. So the suffrage movement then will pick up again in the Gilded Age, and will go really hot and heavy into the Progressive era. The big women's suffrage group was the National Women's Suffrage Association that was formed in 1869, so this is still really part of the Gilded Age. And what they fought for was a constitutional amendment. You have people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton that are going to be part of that. And then also around the same time, you have the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, and then they were looking more at this idea of winning the right to vote on a state-by-state basis. Now, as we mentioned the other day, women in the Western territories actually gained the right to vote before most women in the United States. And the reasons for that, if you remember, was because of the sense of equality, that because women played a really significant role working side by side with the men in the fields and in the house, and they were perceived as being more equal to men, and that they should have the right to vote. And then also what the Western states wanted was representation, and they needed more people voting. And so it was important for them, in order to get their rural issues to keep it, I guess, into the national limelight, that they have to vote on legislation and stuff that is going to promote rural issues. So giving women the right to vote would help out with that. So the first territory that gave women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1869, followed by Utah in 1877. That's a great picture in the background here. These are what are called suffragettes. So women who fought for the right to vote were called suffragettes. And then you have all these women here, and then you have the governor of Wyoming signing the legislation giving women that right to vote. I think in today's society, we're like, this is just kind of a given. I mean, women should have the right to vote. There's definitely arguments for women having the right to vote and arguments against having the right to vote. So let's look at some of these things. When it comes to the women's suffragettes and giving reasons why they should have the right to vote, a lot of them believe that if you look at the 14th Amendment, that women have citizenship rights, so with citizenship, shouldn't women also have the right to vote? Or what about like all these men who have the right to vote who don't even care about voting or don't even bother to vote or are not educated and don't even know the issues or anything. And then here you have all these women who are up on the issues of the day. You have all these municipal reformers who really know and understand what politics is about. How is that right to have quote unquote ignorant men or men who don't care to have the right to vote, and then here you have all these women who truly care and again understand the issues, and they don't have the right to vote? So how does it make sense? And then also going back to the idea of municipal housekeeping, that all these domestic issues that we've been talking about, things like children's issues, education, sanitation issues, just cleanly issues like with like air pollution and stuff like that, that with these types of issues, women tend to be more concerned about that. And if women never have the right to vote, then we'll never deal with those issues. So women should have the right to vote to help deal with those more domestic societal issues and help clean up society as a whole. And then I think probably one of the best arguments that women had was this last one here, where they're going to say that this is a big criticism of Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson, one of the reasons he says that the United States needs to go into the war is to make the world safe for democracy. You know, this idea of democracy where the people have the right to say what happens in their governments. Well, does that not include women? How is it that we're promoting democracy overseas and saying that all those countries over in Europe that are entrenched in these empires, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that they should all have freedom and the people should choose their own governments? You know, why is it that we're focusing on what is going on in Europe, yet we're not focusing on democracy here in the United States, where you have half the American population not even having the ability to legally vote? So women are going to use World War I as an argument as to why they should have the right to vote. Well, what about the anti-suffragists? Those people who thought that women should not have the right to vote. And I'm going to be honest with you guys that there were many women that did not believe women should have the right to vote, because they really advocated the whole concept of the cult of domesticity. And their argument is really going to be the number one point here, that if you don't have women taking care of the home and the family, then what is going to happen to the American family? You'll have the collapse of that. Kind of like what you see in this political cartoon, this image. You know, you have a house falling apart. You have the children who are on the floor crying. Dad looks disheveled and has no idea what he's doing. You have this lamp here. Looks like it's burned out, maybe potentially even starting a fire or something like that. So these anti-suffragists are going to say that this is the role of women, and it's a 50-50 relationship, that there's nothing wrong with men being in the public sphere and women being in the private sphere. Many people believe that the idea of voting was masculine, so women should not have the right to vote because it would take away their femininity, that women were not educated to make decisions, because, I mean, let's face it, even at this point in time, most women did not go to school. But on the flip side of that, and when I say school, by the way, I mean like higher education. But on the flip side of that, most men didn't go to college either. It was really just the people on top of society, you know, even still at this time. Again, I talked about the argument about the liquor industry, those people who were anti-prohibition. They didn't want women to have the right to vote, because if women had the right to vote, they would vote for prohibition. And our society has always been patriarchal, and men should make decisions for the family. Men should make decisions for society as a whole. So these are the most significant of the anti-suffrage arguments. Here's a kind of a funny political cartoon. Here you have this woman, and she had just gone to vote over here. She cast her ballot. And she's like, "Oh no." So the caption says, "While in the act of voting, Mrs. Jones remembers that she has left a cake in the oven." So women, again, their role should be in the house. So here she is baking a cake in the oven. She left the stove on. She went to go vote. Now she probably freaking burned down the house. Not her role. She shouldn't be doing that. What were the different tactics and strategies of the suffragettes in gaining the right to vote? Let me go back here a little bit. The NWSA and the AWSA, you're going to have kind of a merging of these two organizations. You'll have what was called NASAW, the National American Association for Right to Vote. National American Women's Suffrage Association. So that is going to be your more conservative of the two suffrage groups I want you guys to remember. So this one I want you to remember, and the NWP. Those are the only two. You don't have to worry about the other ones. So Nassau was headed up by Carrie Chapman Catt, and again, more conservative in the sense that she wanted to focus more on getting suffrage on a state-by-state basis. Let the states decide for themselves at their own pace. So this is more conservative. And you have people like this woman over here, who's Alice Paul, much more radicalized, and she formed the National Women's Party. And they were more radical in the sense that they pushed for that constitutional amendment. So once you have that amendment, then it applies to the country as a whole. So it's much quicker. I mean, getting the amendment itself can be problematic and take time, but once it's done, it's done. Now, they're also more radical because of the methods that they're going to embark upon. So the NWP, the National Women's Party, they're the ones out there chaining themselves, handcuffing themselves to like the wrought iron gate at the White House. They're picketing, they're protesting, they're practicing civil disobedience by forcing themselves into voting places and actually physically voting, which is against the law. Many of these people that were part of the National Women's Party, they were out protesting, and they were getting arrested. One case in particular, Alice Paul is pretty awesome. She went to jail several times. One of the times she was in jail, she decided to go on a hunger strike, and she ended up having to be force fed. They took a funnel, and they put a tube on the funnel, and they stuffed the tube down her throat, so the funnel sticking out of her mouth, and they would crack eggs open, and they would put the eggs inside of these funnels, and it would just go down into her stomach. And so she was force-fed in that manner. So that, I mean, for a woman of that, I wouldn't do that. I mean, that's kind of, that's out there, more power to her. You had women outside the White House for months on end. They called them the Silent Sentinels. They were protesting every single day. Nassau and the NWP are going to meet with legislators. Some of them met with Wilson. Again, what is Wilson's position on this? Wilson's position was more of a state-by-state basis. It wasn't he was completely anti-women's suffrage, but he didn't really advocate women getting a constitutional amendment. So if a state wants to do it, then fine, but not at the federal level. Another tactic that the suffragettes used was they became partisan. They would support anybody that would support suffrage. So if the Republican Party was going to support it, they would support them. If the Democratic Party was going to support it, they would support the Democrats. So they became very partisan in that sense. And then here are some images of suffragettes protesting. This is outside of the White House. And not in this particular photograph, but you can find some of these where they are handcuffed to this gate. This is literally right outside of the White House. Woodrow Wilson, by the way, was furious because he was being targeted. Remember, women are going to be using World War I as a reason why women should have the right to vote. They'll actually liken Woodrow Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Here's a parade in Michigan, votes for women. So that was our tactic, and that's part of educating the public. Rally for the women's suffrage amendment. Posters, what are called broadsides, all over the place. So again, getting back to Woodrow Wilson and his perspective on this, like I said, he does support suffrage in theory, but he doesn't really do much about it. If a state wanted to do something, then great. Here's where Wilson had an issue. Like I said, Wilson began to take a lot of this personally because a lot of the signs that these women were holding up, they were targeting him specifically. So here's the one I was talking about, where they were likening Wilson to the Kaiser of Germany. Now remember, in Germany at this time, Germany was an autocratic nation. They did not have a democracy. So basically these women are saying, you're just as bad as him, that you are not making the world safe for democracy. You are not promoting democracy when you are not doing that here in the United States. Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? You want to ensure democracy overseas, but what about here? You have 20 million American women that are not self-governed, that do not have the right to self-determination. Take the beam out of your own eye. I mean, that's some pretty heavy criticism. So when he was getting all this criticism, he started to kind of bark back a little bit, and he was like on record calling these suffragettes unfeminine, insulting, unpatriotic. But here's the thing. Woodrow Wilson is going to have to gain the support of American women. And again, the reason for that is because of World War I. Once we get involved in World War I in 1917, we got all these guys who were fighting overseas. Well, the United States, our biggest role was to provide the food, to provide the supplies, to provide the weaponry that was needed to win the war. Well, if all of the guys working in the factory are overseas, who's going to be working in the factories? Oh, crap, I need the women to do that. Oh, I better make them happy. So women are able to use suffrage as leverage. Sure, we'll work for you in the factories. Give us the right to vote. Okay? So women will use their actions in the war to gain the right to vote. And then in 1920, you will finally have the 19th Amendment ratified, and women finally receive the right to vote. From my understanding, kind of a cool little story is the Senate only needed one more vote in order for women to gain the right to vote. And I guess just needed that one guy, and this one senator, he put his hand in his jacket pocket on the Senate floor, and there was a piece of paper in there. And he pulled out the piece of paper, and it was a letter from his mother. And on that letter, she basically talked about do the right thing, that women deserve the right to vote. So here his mother is telling him, this is what you need to do. And he followed through. And then that was the deciding vote that gave women the right to vote. So yay. One of the things actually that's really sad about this is that all of those women who've been fighting for so long, people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, none of them got to see the day that women had the right to vote. And when you think about this in time and space, I know for you guys 1920 seems like forever and a day ago, but in history it really isn't. It was like yesterday. So women only very recently have gained the right to vote. And what were the effects of this then? I mean, you would think that women would be going out in droves. Not going to happen though, to be honest with you. Women did not revolutionize politics. You still have many women who didn't think women should have the right to vote, so they didn't vote. We do have political apathy as a whole, men or women, in the United States. So it wasn't like women did come out in droves and droves and droves and make a huge political impact. I do think that because you have, or you had this women's movement, and women became more politicized, the progressive era and the municipal housekeeping and all of that, I do think that women are more political as a result of all of these actions bringing women that right to vote. So you do see things like having more women in Congress, and just other political positions. You have the creation, still around today, what's called the League of Women Voters. They go through all of the issues with the propositions, those initiatives and those referendums, and they break it down for you and make it easy to understand. What else? Because women do have the right to vote, a lot of times women will vote as a block. And sometimes, for some issues, that legislators, they are forced to listen to women because they know if this is a women's issue, like I think today one of the issues we're going to see is Planned Parenthood. I think you will see many women voting in a block around that particular issue, either for it or against it. But legislators have to listen to women, because if it's an issue that women care enough about, we're 50% of the population. So you're going to have to listen to that constituency. The idea of the cult of domesticity, I think we're seeing that is diminishing even more, because you have more and more women who are choosing the public sphere over the domestic sphere. More women are working. We'll have more women gaining more independence in their lives. More women will, just be out there and voting and running for public office and being a part of the political life of the United States. So that, I think, is important. The one thing, though, and this, I have women here, but this also, I think, still is going to apply to African American men as well, that minority women are still disenfranchised. So what I mean by that is minority women still can't vote. I mean, you still have grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes. Those are also going on in the South. So even with the 19th Amendment, African American women still did not really have the right to vote. Same thing with African American men. Even though you have the 15th Amendment, because you have the grandfather clauses, the literacy test, the poll taxes, that even African American men still do not have the right to vote. So for them, these are kind of empty promises, or empty pieces of legislation. It's not going to be until much later that that issue will actually be addressed and solved. And it appears that my slide is frozen. Oh, there we go. I don't think that's what it is. All right. Wilson's second term. There's going to be a presidential election in 1916. One of the things that Woodrow Wilson campaigned upon pretty heavy was that he was going to keep the United States out of the war. World War I started in 1914. The spark that got everything going was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, his wife Sophie. So Wilson is promising to keep the United States out of the war. However, just within a matter of months after Wilson taking the oath of office into his second term, he will declare war, or Congress will declare war, I should say, and we will move into World War I. So what then is the legacy of progressivism? Because really, with the coming of World War I, you can say that's what kind of is going to put an end to the massive amount of progressive reforms that we've been talking about, because really the focus is going to be on the war effort itself. So some of the things we've talked about in terms of what's significant about progressivism as a whole: the government completely redefined this idea that the government plays a significant role in the lives of its citizens. We'll find in the 1920s, it's going to kind of go back to the opposite, laissez-faire, but then it's going to go back to this more active government when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1932. Also with progressivism, the executive branch becomes a dominant branch of government. You have reforms that touch so many people's lives. But when you look at who's left out, blacks are totally left out. We talked about how the progressives really, I mean, the only exception is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. But when it comes to African American issues, really nothing is going to change for them. So progressivism from African Americans was kind of a meh. I'll skip that one for a minute. So the muckrakers, you have those people out there, those journalists they're the ones that open the eyes of a lot of people. So people like Jacob Riis, people like Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, Upton Sinclair, that they open up people's eyes to actually understand all these problems that were going on in society, really as a result of industrialization. And so what the progressives wanted to do was to fix and to solve all those problems that came as a result of industrialization. You can see that democracy was increased, not for everyone, but women do get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So democracy increases actually quite significantly in that respect. Let me go back to when I skipped. So this idea of imperialism and racism, this is going to be the topic of our next unit. A lot of progressives believe that we needed to have colonies, and one of the reasons is going to be a very social Darwinist explanation for that we need to uplift people in other nations who are considered quote-unquote savage or backwards. The last point I have here, I think, is, for me, one of the reasons why I like the progressive era so much, this idea that people, and not just government people, politicians, legislators, but just people like Jane Addams and Jacob Riis and Lincoln Steffens, that they had this belief that we have the ability to actually implement change, that, you know, it's not all doom and gloom, that it's in our nature to actually do positive things and to make our society a better place. And I like that. It's a very optimistic outlook on things. So yay for the progressives. So with World War I and our entry in 1917, it really is the end of an era. And again, the question is, how long can the United States stay out? Like I said, Woodrow Wilson, he campaigned on this idea of keeping us out of the war, but it just came to the point, through various reasons, which we'll discuss in our next unit, that we had to get involved. And the fact of the matter is that once we do get involved in World War I, it is going to outshadow progressivism. And really the last piece of progressive legislation, major piece, is going to be the 19th Amendment, which again is women have that right to vote in 1920. And that brings us to the end of the unit. So yay for that. Oh.
The progressive era is an amazing era. It'll take you by storm with all those reforms. Women play a big role to keep the workers off the door. Children in factories, slaving as angelic The progressive era is an amazing era. It'll take you by storm with all those reforms. Municipal, state, and federal. Changing life for better of all. Hanging fruits from a temperance tree just so the little guy can be free. The progressive era is an amazing era. It'll take you by storm with all the reforms. got conservative stuck in a tub. Wilson's a moderate, aptly led. Get help to create the fad. Progressive era, it's an amazing era. It'll take you by storm with all the reforms. Progressive era, it's an amazing era. It will take you by storm with all the reforms.
Hey.